am your boss. You can't kick me out of my dad's plane.
Miss, please calm down.
No, this is my plane.
Picture this. Two black teenagers being escorted down the aisle of a first-class cabin while passengers stare. A well-dressed white woman clutches her purse, watching with satisfaction. The lead flight attendant says those words that will change everything. "I'm sorry, but there's been a mistake with your tickets." 15-year-old Maya's voice trembles as she responds, "But my dad bought these seats." Now, jump forward just 10 minutes. An airport terminal. A tall black man in an immaculate suit walks with purpose. Phone pressed his ear. His voice is deadly calm when he says, "Cancel the merger. All of it." The person on the other end protests, "Sir, that's $340 million. He doesn't hesitate. "I said cancel it. Now." You won't believe what happens next. But to understand how we got here, we need to go back 2 hours earlier. Because this story isn't just about what happened on that plane. It's about two kids, one powerful father, and a $340 million decision that would shake an entire airline industry. Let me introduce you to Maya and Marcus Johnson. At the gate, before any of this chaos began, they were just two excited teenagers about to experience first class for the very first time. Maya, 15 years old, stood there in her debate team jacket, organized and responsible as always, checking their tickets for probably the 5th time. Everything had to be perfect. Her younger brother Marcus, 13, had his headphones draped around his neck, completely absorbed in his notebook where he was sketching intricate airplane designs. The kid was obsessed with aviation, with how things worked, with the engineering behind flight itself. These weren't spoiled rich kids. They were unaccompanied minors who had flown alone before, always in economy, always making do. But this time was different. This time, their father, David Johnson, had splurged on first-class tickets. Not because he was trying to show off, but because he wanted this trip to be special. You see, they were flying to Atlanta for their mother Jennifer's surprise 40th birthday party. David was flying separately for business, planning to meet them there. And he'd worked so hard to afford these tickets, to give his kids this one experience. This one moment where they could feel like they mattered, like they belonged in spaces that so often made people who looked like them feel unwelcome. Maya kept thinking about that as she clutched those boarding passes. Her dad had worked so hard. This was important to him. She wasn't going to mess it up. Marcus, in his typical Marcus fashion, was less concerned with the symbolic weight of first-class tickets and more interested in observing everything around him. And that's when he noticed her, a woman, probably in her 50s, wearing a Chanel suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, dripping in diamond jewelry, staring at them with barely concealed disdain. Her name was Christine Bradford, though the kids didn't know that yet. All they knew was a look in her eyes, that particular kind of look that makes your skin crawl, that makes you suddenly hyper-aware of your own existence in a space. Marcus nudged Maya, but she was already aware. "Ignore her," she whispered. "We belong here just as much as anyone else." They boarded early, as unaccompanied minors do. The flight attendant checked their tickets with a warm smile. Seats 2A and 2B confirmed. Everything was legitimate. Everything was fine. The attendant even helped them stow their carry-ons, asked if they needed anything. For a moment, Maya let herself relax. This was going to be okay. This was going to be great. Actually, they settled into their seats, and it felt like sinking into luxury. The leather was soft. The space was enormous compared to economy. Marcus immediately pulled out his tablet and dove into a coding project he'd been working on. At 13, the kid was already teaching himself Python and JavaScript, building apps that actually worked. Maya pulled out her book, The Autobiography of Malcolm X, a choice that wasn't accidental. She'd been reading it for her AP history class, but it had become more than an assignment. It had become something personal. And then Christine Bradford boarded. She walked down that first-class aisle like she owned it, like she owned the entire plane. And when she reached row 2 and saw who was sitting in seats A and B, her face did something interesting. Disgust quickly masked the surprise, that performative shock that certain people do so well. She was assigned to seat 2C, the aisle seat, which meant she'd be sitting in the same row as these two black teenagers for the next several hours. You could see her mind working, calculating, deciding. She settled into her seat, but not really. She was perched, uncomfortable, radiating displeasure. Marcus was oblivious, lost in his code. Maya tried to focus on her book, but she could feel it, that tension, that energy that screamed something was about to happen. Christine Bradford waited exactly 4 minutes. I know this because of what came out later, the timestamps, the details that would matter. She waited 4 minutes, and then she flagged down the senior flight attendant. Patricia, a woman in her 40s with 15 years of experience with this airline, approached with professional courtesy. "Excuse me," Christine said, loud enough that her voice carried. "Are those children supposed to be in first class?" Patricia, to her credit, was polite but firm. "Yes, ma'am, they're confirmed passengers." But Christine wasn't done. She made her voice even louder, ensuring that other passengers would start paying attention. "Alone? In first class? That seems unusual." And just like that, heads turned. Other passengers started looking, some with curiosity, some with concern, some with that particular expression that says they've already made up their minds about what's happening here. Christine continued, "I travel this route weekly. I've never seen unaccompanied children up here." Maya, feeling every single eye on her, spoke quietly, respectfully, the way her parents had taught her to speak to adults. "We have tickets, ma'am." Christine didn't even look at her, didn't acknowledge she'd spoken. She kept her eyes on Patricia, speaking only to the flight attendant as if Maya was invisible, as if her words didn't matter, as if she wasn't even fully human enough to warrant direct address. "Can you verify their tickets?" Christine said, "I just want to make sure everything is legitimate." That word, legitimate. Say it with enough suspicion, enough insinuation, and it becomes an accusation. Patricia was clearly uncomfortable. You could see it in her face, the way she hesitated, the way her training was warring with her instincts. But she was also thinking about airline policy, about corporate counts, about not making waves with frequent flyers who spent thousands of dollars a year with the company. "May I see your tickets again?" Patricia asked Maya, trying to make her voice gentle, apologetic. Maya's hands were shaking slightly as she pulled them up on her phone. She handed the device over, and Patricia examined the digital boarding passes, while a second flight attendant, Derek, a man in his 30s, joined them. Derek whispered something to Patricia, and she pulled out her own device, cross-referencing something, frowning. Christine, watching this, pressed her advantage. "I thought so. Those seats were purchased with my company's miles program. There must be fraud involved." Maya felt her stomach drop. "My dad bought these. David Johnson." Christine's response dripped with condescension. "Of course he did, sweetheart." That tone, that patronizing, dismissive tone that makes you feel small, that makes you question yourself even when you know you're right. Patricia was on the phone now, calling gate services, and Maya could hear the captain's voice over the intercom. "Flight attendants, prepare for departure." Marcus whispered to his sister, "Should we call Dad?" Maya, trying to hold it together, trying to be the responsible older sister, said, "It's fine. We have tickets. This is just a misunderstanding." But it wasn't fine. Patricia hung up the phone and turned to them with an expression that was apologetic but final. "I'm sorry, but we need to sort this out at the gate. We can't delay departure." "But our tickets are valid." Maya started. Derek cut her off, professional but firm. "We'll get you on the next flight. Please gather your things." And just like that, it was over. The decision had been made. 2 children with valid tickets, purchased legitimately, confirmed by the airline's own system, were being removed from the aircraft because a white woman had complained. Marcus and Maya gathered their belongings in silence. Every eye in that first-class cabin was on them. Some passengers looked away, uncomfortable but unwilling to intervene. Others stared openly. One person had their phone out, filming. The walk down the aisle was the longest walk of Maya's young life. Every step felt like judgment. Every gaze felt like condemnation. And Christine Bradford sat there in seat 2C, clutching her purse, looking satisfied, vindicated, as if she'd just made the world a little bit safer, a little bit more orderly, a little bit more the way she thought it should be. In the jetway, away from the other passengers, Maya finally broke. Tears she'd been holding back started falling. "Why didn't you listen to us?" she asked Patricia, her voice cracking. Patricia, clearly uncomfortable, fell back on corporate speak. "It's policy when there's a ticket dispute. For your safety." Marcus, his voice harder than his 13 years should allow, said, "Our safety? We were fine until she complained." At the gate, the agent, a tired-looking man in his 50s named Robert, said he'd see what he could do. He typed on his computer, and then his eyes widened. He looked up at Maya and Marcus with an expression that was equal parts shock and horror. These tickets were purchased by David Johnson, Executive Platinum member, valid tickets. Patricia went pale. Derek asked, "So they could get back on?" Robert shook his head. Flights already pushed back from the gate. Maya, her voice breaking completely now, said, "Can you call my dad? Please." And that's when everything changed. Let me tell you about David Johnson. 90 minutes earlier, before any of this happened, he was in his corner office in San Francisco, floor-to-ceiling windows, view of the Golden Gate Bridge. The kind of office that speaks of power even before you meet the man who occupies it. But David wasn't flashy. Everything about him was controlled, precise. His suit was custom-tailored but understated. His watch was vintage, valuable but not ostentatious. He moved with the kind of confidence that comes from having built something from nothing, from having proven himself over and over again in rooms that didn't want him there. David Johnson was the CEO of Stratosphere Capital, a private equity firm that he'd founded 12 years earlier with money he'd saved from his first startup exit. The company managed over $2 billion in assets. But David wasn't the kind of CEO who forgot where he came from. On his desk, next to his computer monitors and the merger documents he was reviewing, was a family photo. Jennifer, his wife of 17 years. Maya, looking serious and intelligent even in a casual snapshot. Marcus, grinning with that particular joy of a kid who hadn't yet learned to hide his enthusiasm. His assistant Lauren, a sharp woman in her 30s who'd been with him since the early days, reminded him, "Your flight to Atlanta is in 2 hours. Kids are already at the airport." David glanced at his phone. A text from Maya with a selfie from the airport. "First class. Thank you, Dad." Red heart, he smiled. That smile that parents get when their kids are happy, when something you did made their world a little brighter. He typed back, "You earned it, sweetheart. See you soon." Another call came through. "Mr. Johnson, the SkyConnect merger documents are ready for your signature." SkyConnect, a mid-tier airline that Stratosphere Capital was acquiring for $340 million. It was a good deal, a smart deal. SkyConnect had decent routes, loyal customers, but they needed capital and better management. David's plan was to modernize their fleet, improve their customer service, expand their routes. This merger would create 3,000 new jobs. That mattered to David. It wasn't just about the returns, though those would be substantial. It was about building something, creating opportunities. He'd even told Lauren earlier that day, "This merger will create 3,000 new jobs." That's what matters. David had no idea that in less than 2 hours, he'd be willing to burn the entire deal to the ground. Maya's phone rang. She saw her dad's name and almost couldn't answer it. Her hands were shaking. But she did. "Hey, sweetie, boarding soon?" David's voice was warm, relaxed. Maya tried to stay calm. She really tried. But her voice cracked immediately. "Dad, they kicked us off." The change in David's voice was instantaneous. Every bit of warmth evaporated, replaced by something cold and sharp. "What?" Maya tried to explain, but the tears were coming now, making it hard to speak. Marcus took the phone from her. "Some lady said our tickets were fake," Marcus said, trying to sound tough but unable to hide the hurt in his voice. "They made us get off in front of everyone." There was a pause. When David spoke again, his voice was different. Controlled, but barely. Like a dam holding back an ocean. "Where's the gate agent?" "Put them on the phone." "Now!" Robert Feldman took the phone with nervous hands. "Mr. Johnson, I apologize for confusion." "What's your name?" "Robert Feldman, sir." Robert, explain to me why my children are not on that aircraft. Robert explained about Christine Bradford's complaint, about the ticket verification, about airline policy for disputed tickets. With every word, he seemed to realize more fully how badly the situation had been mishandled. When he finished, there was silence on the other end. Then David spoke, and his voice was so calm it was terrifying. And you removed 2 unaccompanied minors from a flight with valid tickets because an adult passenger complained? Sir, it was a judgment call. What airline? Skyconnect, sir. Another pause. Longer this time. Robert didn't know it, but in that pause, David Johnson was connecting dots, processing information, recalibrating everything. Let me speak to your supervisor. And Robert? Start looking for a new job. Within 10 minutes, David was on the phone with Janet Mills, the airport supervisor for Skyconnect. She was defensive from the first word, falling back on corporate speak. We take these situations seriously, Mr. Johnson. Do you know who I am, Ms. Mills? A platinum member, sir, and we value. David cut her off. I'm the CEO of Stratosphere Capital. We're currently finalizing a $340 million acquisition of Skyconnect Airlines. The papers are on my desk right now. Silence. Complete, total silence. Now, David continued, that dangerous calm still in his voice. Let me ask again, why were my children removed from first class? Janet Mills was scrambling now. You could hear it in her voice. I'll review the incident immediately. You have 10 minutes. I want security footage, staff statements, and the name of every person involved. While Janet scrambled, David's assistant Lauren was already working her own magic. She pulled up Christine Bradford's information within minutes. She's VP of Operations at Westfield Insurance, Lauren told David. They have a $50 million corporate account with Skyconnect. Keep digging, David said, and Lauren dug. What she found would change everything. Over the next hour, while Maya and Marcus sat in an airport family lounge trying to process what had happened to them, Lauren compiled a file that read like an indictment. Christine Bradford had filed 47 complaints with Skyconnect in just 18 months. 47. Every single one was against passengers of color. Every single complaint was filed when she encountered them in first class. Not one resulted in actual ticket fraud or violations. Not one, because there was never any fraud. There was just Christine Bradford's discomfort with sharing premium cabin space with people who didn't look like her. And Skyconnect? They'd never investigated. Not once. They just issued flight credits to appease her, moved other passengers, rebooked them, did whatever it took to keep their $50 million corporate client happy. David also made another call to Richard Chun, a member of his board and a longtime friend. David, Richard said, the merger closes tomorrow. Don't do anything rash. Define rash. Whatever you're thinking right now. David looked at the family photo on his desk. His kids, his beautiful, intelligent, worthy kids who'd just been humiliated for the crime of existing in a space while black. And then David did something Richard didn't expect. He got quiet, reflective. Richard, how many times have you been kicked off a flight? Never. How many times have your kids? David, this merger was supposed to change Skyconnect's culture. Clearly, they need more than capital. They need a complete overhaul. In the airport lounge, Marcus turned to Maya. Is Dad going to sue them? Maya shook her head. I don't know. I just feel so stupid. You didn't do anything wrong. I know, but everyone looked at us like we didn't belong there. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Do you think Mom ever felt like this? Maya looked at her brother. All the time. That's why Dad worked so hard. The airport TV was showing business news. The ticker at the bottom of the screen read, Breaking. Stratosphere Capital merger with Skyconnect in final stages. Marcus saw it first. Wait, that's Dad's company. Maya looked up. And that's the airline that just kicked us off. They looked at each other. Marcus's eyes went wide. Oh no. Maya's expression was different. There was something fierce in it. Something that looked a lot like her father. Oh yes. Because they knew their dad. They knew that when David Johnson got quiet, when he got that particular kind of calm, that's when he was most dangerous. At SkyConnect's executive offices, an emergency video conference was called. Present were CEO Thomas Weatherby, a man in his 60s who represented the old guard airline executives, along with the CFO, COO, legal team, and Janet Mills, who was already updating her resume in her head. Thomas Weatherby, who'd been in the airline business for 40 years, who thought he'd seen everything, asked the question everyone was thinking. Someone tell me why our largest penny investor is threatening to walk. Janet explained the incident. Every word made the situation worse. The legal counsel tried to minimize it. The flight attendants followed protocol for disputed tickets. The COO shot that down immediately. The tickets weren't disputed. They were valid. A passenger complained. The CFO added context that made everything even more complicated. Christine Bradford, she's Westfield Insurance, major corporate client. Thomas Weatherby rubbed his temples. So we sided with a corporate account over 2 kids? Silence. And these kids belong to David Johnson, who's about to own 40% of this airline. More silence. The kind of silence that happens when everyone in the room realizes simultaneously that they're in serious trouble. The legal counsel, desperate to salvage something, suggested, "We should offer compensation. Flight credits. Apology letter." The phone rang. Thomas answered. David Johnson's voice came through the speaker, and everyone in that conference room felt the temperature drop. "Mr. Weatherby, we need to talk." What happened next would become legendary in business schools, a case study in how power, when wielded with precision, can force institutional change. "I'm looking at 18 months of complaints from Christine Bradford," David said. 47 incidents. Harassment, discrimination, creating hostile environments. Your staff enabled her. Thomas tried to respond with corporate damage control. "Mr. Johnson, I assure you will investigate." "I already did. Your company culture protects profits over people. Specifically, it protects white comfort over everyone else's dignity." That's a serious accusation. It's a documented pattern. I also found 200-plus similar complaints from other passengers of color. Dismissed. Unresolved. Buried. Thomas Weatherby was sweating now. He'd been in tough negotiations before, but this was different. This wasn't about money. This was about something that money couldn't fix. "What do you want?" David's answer came without hesitation, like he'd been preparing this list in his mind for the past hour. "Initially, I wanted to burn this merger to the ground and watch your stock collapse. And now I want something more permanent." David laid out his terms, and they were comprehensive, specific, and non-negotiable. Christine Bradford would be permanently banned from SkyConnect. Not suspended, not given a warning, banned. Her name would go on a list, and she would never set foot on one of their aircraft again. Westfield Insurance's corporate account would be suspended pending their response to what their VP of operations had been doing with their company's airline benefits. Complete anti-discrimination training overhaul for all staff. Not the usual corporate checkbox training, but real, meaningful education with accountability measures. An independent review board for passenger complaints, with members from civil rights organizations, with real power to investigate and recommend action. 3 board seats would go to candidates David personally selected, all from underrepresented backgrounds, people who understood what it meant to be treated as less than, people who would never let this happen again. A $10 million fund for diversity initiatives and employee training, managed independently. Patricia and Derek, the flight attendants who'd removed his children, would be suspended pending investigation, not fired outright, because David believed in the possibility of education and growth, but suspended, investigated, required to undergo intensive training before returning to work. A public apology to his children, not some corporate statement, but a real, personal apology from the CEO himself. And if SkyConnect refused any of these terms, David would walk. He'd cancel the merger, and he'd release all the discrimination data he'd compiled to every major media outlet in the country. Thomas Weatherby tried one last play. "You're blackmailing us." David's response was ice. I'm correcting a system that kicked children off a plane for being black in first class. Call it whatever you want. Then David made another call, this one to Maya and Marcus, who were still in the airport lounge. Try and make sense of everything. Dad, we're okay, Maya said when she answered. I know you are. You're strong. But you shouldn't have to be strong against this kind of treatment. What's going to happen? Change. Real change. Not just for you, but for everyone who looks like us and gets treated like they don't belong. Marcus took the phone. Did you cancel the merger? No. I'm going through with it. Because now I'll have the power to fix things from the inside. So we ruin your business deal? David's voice softened. You didn't ruin anything. They did. And now they'll pay for it. Not with money, but with accountability. Maya asked quietly, will we get back on a plane? Yes, on my private jet, which is picking you up in 1 hour. Marcus's voice perked up. We have a private jet as of 30 minutes ago. Yes, some things are worth the investment. 6 weeks later, the news was everywhere. SkyConnect announces major diversity initiative following discrimination allegations. Christine Bradford resigns from Westfield Insurance amid scandal. Airline industry faces reckoning over passenger treatment. In a SkyConnect first-class cabin, flight attendants, including Patricia, sat through new training sessions. Real training, led by diversity consultants who didn't pull punches, who made people uncomfortable in a way that leads to actual growth. In an interview that would later go viral, Patricia said something that took courage. I thought I was following policy. I didn't see I was enforcing bias. That's on me to fix. The new passenger complaint system was anonymous, transparent, tracked. Every complaint was logged, investigated, reported publicly in aggregate. Patterns couldn't hide anymore. David's board appointees took their seats. A former civil rights attorney, a disability advocate, a Latino aviation executive who'd spent 20 years fighting for inclusion in an industry that didn't want him. They brought perspectives that had never existed in that boardroom before, and they brought power to back up those perspectives. In first-class cabins across SkyConnect's fleet, something shifted. There were noticeably more diverse passengers, not because of quotas or optics, but because the culture had changed, because people felt safer, because discrimination was no longer tolerated. On one flight, a young black girl, maybe 10 years old, sat confidently in first class with her parents. She was reading, completely unbothered, completely belonging. She didn't know the story of Maya and Marcus Johnson. She didn't know about the fight that had been fought. So she could sit in that seat without fear. She just knew she belonged there. And that was the point. At the Johnson family home in Atlanta, Jennifer's 40th birthday party finally happened. Weeks later than planned, but no less joyful. Maya and Marcus were telling the story to their younger cousins, who listened with wide eyes. And then what happened? One cousin asked. Marcus grinned. Dad made them change everything. Maya corrected him, her voice carrying that wisdom that comes from experience. We made them change, by not being ashamed of who we are. David overheard this and smiled. Jennifer pulled her husband aside. You didn't have to buy a jet. Yes, I did. Our kids will never be made to feel less than for existing in a space they paid for. What about the other kids? The ones whose parents can't buy airlines? David looked at his wife, and she could see in his eyes that fire that had driven him from a kid in a neighborhood where people didn't expect much from you to a CEO who could move hundreds of millions of dollars with a phone call. That's why I didn't just threaten them. I'm on the board now. Those kids have an advocate. In Maya and Marcus's shared bedroom, on the wall between their beds, there was something new. Maya's debate trophy still stood on her shelf. Marcus's aviation sketches still covered his bulletin board. But now, hanging in a simple frame between them, were 2 boarding passes. First class, seats 2A and 2B. The boarding passes from that flight they never took. Some people might ask why they'd keep them, why they'd frame a reminder of one of the worst days of their young lives. But Maya and Marcus knew why. People asked if they'd do it differently. Avoid that seat. Stay quiet. Make themselves smaller. But they weren't the problem. They never were. And they never will be. Sometimes the cost of change is discomfort. And sometimes that discomfort is exactly what the world needs. In his office in San Francisco, David Johnson sat at his desk, signing the final SkyConnect merger papers. The deal that had almost died was now complete. $340 million, 3,000 new jobs, and more importantly, a complete restructuring of a company's culture. The camera would pull back to reveal what hung on David's office wall. That family photo was still there, but next to it now was a framed news article. SkyConnect leads industry in passenger rights reform. Real change happens when those with power choose justice over comfort. This wasn't just a story about a CEO who canceled a merger. It was a story about two kids who refused to be ashamed, about a father who had the power to demand accountability and used it, about an airline that learned the hard way that discrimination has consequences, about a woman who thought her comfort mattered more than other people's dignity and discovered she was wrong. But more than that, it's a story about every person who's ever been made to feel like they don't belong. Every kid who's been followed in a store. Every professional who's been mistaken for the help. Every family that's been seated at the worst table. Every person who's had to be twice as good to get half as far. This story is for them. Because sometimes justice isn't just about the law. It's about power and what you choose to do with it. What would you have done in David Johnson's position? Would you have walked away from $340 million? Or would you have done exactly what he did? Use that leverage to force change that would protect not just your own children, but every child who came after them. If this story moved you, if it made you think, if it reminded you that change is possible when people refuse to accept injustice, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button, because there are more stories like this that need to be told. Stories of people who stood up, who fought back, who refused to make themselves smaller so others could be more comfortable. And I'm going to keep telling them. The walk down that aisle will haunt Maya Johnson for the rest of her life. Every step felt like a mile. I felt like a spotlight. Maya, 15 years old, clutching her brother's hand so tightly her knuckles went white, fought back tears with everything she had. She wouldn't cry. Not in front of these people. Not in front of the woman who'd done this to them. Marcus, 13 years old, wasn't fighting tears. He was fighting something else. Confusion. Raw, unfiltered hurt. His face asked questions his mouth couldn't form. Why is this happening? What did we do wrong? Why won't anyone help us? The other passengers stared. Some looked away quickly, embarrassed to be witnessing this humiliation, but not embarrassed enough to say anything, to intervene, to ask a single question about why two children with valid tickets were being removed from an aircraft. Others stared openly, their faces a mix of curiosity and judgment, already creating narratives in their minds about what must have happened, what these kids must have done. One passenger had their phone out, recording, capturing this moment of shame, this public degradation of two children, probably already thinking about the social media engagement they get, the likes, the shares, the comments. And Christine Bradford? She sat in seat 2C. In that aisle seat she fought so hard to keep exclusive. And she said something that would later be captured on that passenger's video, something that would go viral for all the wrong reasons. Loud enough for others to hear, loud enough to ensure maximum humiliation. She said, "These things happen when people try to fly above their station." Above their station. As if first class was some kind of aristocratic privilege. As if the price of a ticket wasn't the only qualification needed. As if these children, these brilliant, worthy, beautiful children, belonged somewhere less than because of the color of their skin. Maya heard it. She stumbled slightly, and Marcus steadied her. Brother and sister, holding each other up, walking through a gauntlet of stares and silence, and one woman's satisfied cruelty. When they reached the jetway, away from the passengers, away from the cameras, Maya finally broke. "Why didn't you listen to us?" The words came out choked, desperate, the plea of a child who'd done everything right and been punished anyway. Patricia, the senior flight attendant who'd made the call to remove them, fell back on the only defense she had: corporate policy, the shield that people hide behind when they don't want to take responsibility for their choices. It's policy when there's a ticket dispute, for your safety. Marcus, His voice harder than any 13-year-old should ever have to be, shot back with truth that cut through the corporate speak like a knife. Our safety? We were fine until she complained. And there it was, the fundamental reality that Patricia couldn't escape, couldn't rationalize away. These kids had been perfectly safe in their seats with their valid tickets until Christine Bradford had decided their presence made her uncomfortable. This wasn't about safety. This wasn't about policy. This was about power and prejudice in a system that valued some people's comfort over other people's dignity. At the gate, Robert Feldman, a man in his 50s who looked as tired as his years, told him he'd see what he could do. He typed on his computer with the resigned efficiency of someone who'd handled countless passenger complaints, ready to rebook these kids on another flight, to smooth this over with flight credits and apologies, to make this minor inconvenience go away. And then his eyes widened. His fingers froze on the keyboard. His face went pale. He looked at Maya and Marcus like he was seeing them for the first time, and what he was seeing terrified him. These tickets were purchased by... He paused, swallowed hard. David Johnson, Executive Platinum member, valid tickets. Patricia, who'd been standing nearby, went pale. Actually pale. The color drained from her face as the implications hit her. Derek, the other flight attendant who helped escort the kids off, asked the question everyone was thinking. So they can get back on? Robert shook his head, and there was genuine regret in his voice now. Flights already pushed back from the gate. Maya's voice, when she spoke, was breaking completely. The last threads of her composure were fraying. Can you call my dad? Please. And that's when everything changed. But to understand just how much everything was about to change, we need to understand who David Johnson really is. 90 minutes earlier, before his children were humiliated, before his world shifted on its axis, David Johnson was in his corner office in San Francisco. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed a view of the Golden Gate Bridge, that iconic symbol of a city built on innovation and ambition. But David barely noticed a view anymore. He'd earned this office, this view, this life, through decades of work that would have broken most people. David Johnson, 42 years old, didn't look like what most people imagine when they think of a private equity CEO. He wasn't flashy. He didn't wear his wealth like a costume. But everything about him screamed quiet power. His suit was custom-tailored, perfectly fitted, but in a conservative navy that wouldn't draw attention. His watch was vintage, valuable to those who knew, invisible to those who didn't. He moved with the controlled precision of a man who'd learned early that he had to be better, smarter, more careful than everyone else in the room just to be seen as equal. He was on a video call with his legal team, discussing the final details of an airline merger. In the background of his office, if you looked carefully, you could see the markers of his success. Degrees from Stanford and Harvard Business School, photos with politicians and business leaders, awards from industry groups. But front and center on his desk, in a simple silver frame, was the thing that mattered most, a family photo. Jennifer, his wife of 17 years, stunning and brilliant. Maya, looking serious and intelligent even in a casual snapshot. Marcus, grinning with the unbridled joy of a kid who hadn't yet learned to hide his enthusiasm from a world that might punish him for it. His assistant Lauren, a sharp woman in her 30s who'd been with David since the early days of Stratosphere Capital, poked her head in to remind him, "Your flight to Atlanta is in 2 hours. Kids are already at the airport." David nodded, glancing at his phone. A text from Maya with a selfie from the airport had just come through. She was beaming, holding up her boarding pass. First class. Thank you, Dad. Red heart. For a moment, David's professional mask slipped. He smiled. A real smile, the kind reserved for people you love most in the world. He typed back, "You earned it, sweetheart. See you soon." And he meant it. Maya had made honor roll again. Marcus had won a regional coding competition. They were good kids, great kids, and David had wanted to do something special for them, to give them an experience that he'd never had at their age, to show them that they belonged in spaces that had once been denied to people who looked like them. Another call came in. "Mr. Johnson, the SkyConnect merger documents are ready for your signature." SkyConnect, a mid-tier airline that Stratosphere Capital was acquiring for $340 million. It was a solid company with good bones, but poor management and outdated systems. David's plan was comprehensive. Modernize the fleet, upgrade the technology, improve customer service training, expand routes to underserved communities. This wasn't just about profit, though the projected returns were excellent. This was about building something, creating value, generating jobs. I'll review on the flight, David said. He mentioned to Lauren, almost as an afterthought, this merger will create 3,000 new jobs. That's what matters. Lauren smiled. She'd heard variations of this speech before. David never forgot where he came from, never forgot what it meant to need a job, to need an opportunity, to need someone to take a chance on you. That's why people who'd worked with David for years stayed loyal. He wasn't just building wealth. He was building opportunity. David had no idea that the airline he was about to acquire, the company he was about to pour hundreds of millions of dollars into, was at that exact moment humiliating his children. Back at the airport terminal, Maya's phone was ringing. Dad. She looked at Marcus, and they shared a moment of sibling communication that needed no words. Should we tell him? Will this ruin everything? Is this our fault? Maya answered, Hey, sweetie, boarding soon? David's voice was warm, relaxed, still in that headspace of father excited to see his kids, still thinking about that selfie Maya had sent, still believing his children were about to have a wonderful first-class experience. Maya tried to stay calm. She really, truly tried. She opened her mouth to say something casual, something that wouldn't worry him, something that would make this all seem like a minor inconvenience. But the moment she heard her father's voice, something broke. Dad, they kicked us off. The change in David Johnson was instantaneous and total. Every bit of warmth evaporated from his voice, replaced by something cold and sharp and absolutely focused. What? Maya tried to explain, but the tears were coming now, and with tears came broken sentences, incomplete thoughts, the overwhelming emotion of a 15-year-old girl who just experienced public humiliation and didn't understand why. Marcus took the phone from his sister. He tried to sound tough, tried to be the strong little brother, but his voice cracked as he said, Some lady said our tickets were fake. They made us get off in front of everyone. There was a pause on the other end of the line. In his San Francisco office, David Johnson stood up from his desk. Lauren, who was still in the room, watched her boss's face change. She'd seen David in high-pressure negotiations. She'd seen him close billion-dollar deals. She'd seen him face down hostile board members and aggressive competitors. But she'd never seen this expression. This wasn't anger. This was something colder, more controlled, more dangerous. Where's the gate agent? David's voice was deadly calm. Put them on the phone. Now! Robert Feldman took the phone with hands that were already starting to shake. He'd been a gate agent for 23 years. He'd handled thousands of passenger complaints. He thought he'd seen everything. But the voice on the other end of this phone call made him realize he was in territory he'd never navigated before. Mr. Johnson, I apologize for confusion. David cut him off. What's your name? Robert Feldman, sir. Robert, explain to me why my children are not on that aircraft. Robert explained. He explained about Christine Bradford's complaint, about the ticket verification procedure, about airline policy for disputed tickets, about not wanting to delay the flight. With every word, he could hear his own justifications getting weaker, could feel the ground crumbling beneath his feet. When he finished, there was silence. Not the silence of someone thinking about what to say, the silence of someone controlling themselves, of someone making calculations, of someone deciding just how much damage they were about to unleash. And you removed 2 unaccompanied minors from a flight with valid tickets because an adult passenger complained? David's voice was so controlled it was terrifying. Robert tried to salvage something. Sir, it was a judgment call. What airline? Robert's mouth went dry. Later, he'd realized this was the moment. This was the question that should have told him everything. But in the moment, he just answered, Skyconnect, sir. Pause. Long pause. In his office, David Johnson was standing at his window, looking out at the Golden Gate Bridge without seeing it. He was looking at the merger documents on his desk. $340 million, 3,000 jobs, months of due diligence and negotiations, papers ready for his signature, a deal that would be celebrated in the business press, that would create enormous value for his investors, that would cement his reputation as one of the most successful private equity CEOs of his generation. All of it was about to become leverage. David's voice dropped to something absolutely cold, a tone that Robert Feldman would remember for the rest of his life. Let me speak to your supervisor. And Robert, start looking for a new job. Robert handed the phone to his supervisor with shaking hands. In the background, Maya and Marcus sat in plastic airport chairs, holding hands, watching adults scramble and panic, not quite understanding what was happening, but knowing somehow that their father was about to change everything. In San Francisco, David was already on another line with Lauren. Cancel my afternoon. Get me our legal team. Get me our PR team. Get me every piece of information we have on SkyConnect's corporate governance, their complaint procedures, their diversity metrics, everything. Lauren didn't ask why. She just moved. She'd learned years ago that when David Johnson used that tone, you executed first and asked questions later. David looked at the family photo on his desk one more time, at Maya's intelligent eyes, at Marcus's joyful grin, at Jennifer's proud smile. He thought about every time he'd been followed in a store, every time he'd been pulled over for driving while black, every time someone had assumed he was the help instead of the executive, every microaggression, every insult, every moment of being made to feel less than. He'd built an empire so his kids wouldn't have to experience that, so they could walk into any space and belong there, so they could sit in first class not as interlopers, but as people who'd earned their place in the world. And SkyConnect, the airline he was about to acquire, had just taught his children the oldest lesson in America, that no matter how valid your ticket is, no matter how much you've earned your place, there will always be someone who thinks you don't belong. David Johnson was about to teach SkyConnect a lesson in return, and it was going to cost them everything they thought they knew about power. The gate supervisor, a woman named Janet Mills who'd been with SkyConnect for 15 years, took Robert's phone with confidence. She'd handled upset passengers before. She had scripts for this. She knew how to de-escalate, how to offer compensation, how to turn angry customers into satisfied ones. But the voice on the other end didn't sound upset. It sounded calm. And that calm was infinitely more frightening than any amount of yelling. Ms. Mills, I'm David Johnson. Your staff just removed my children from a flight. Children with valid tickets. I'd like to know why. Janet launched into her practice response. We take these situations very seriously, Mr. Johnson. I assure you will investigate. Do you know who I am, Ms. Mills? Janet paused. She pulled up her computer, typed in his name. Executive Platinum member. Frequent flyer. High-value customer. A Platinum member, sir, and we value. David's voice cut through her corporate speak like a scalpel. I'm the CEO of Stratosphere Capital. We're currently finalizing a $340 million acquisition of SkyConnect Airlines. The papers are on my desk right now, and signed. Janet Mills felt her stomach drop. She pulled up her browser, typed frantically, and there it was. Bloomberg, Wall Street Journal, Forbes, all reporting on the pending Stratosphere Capital acquisition of SkyConnect. Closing date, tomorrow. Deal size, $340 million. And the CEO of Stratosphere Capital was David Johnson, the David Johnson whose children or staff had just humiliated. Now, David continued, that dangerous calm still perfectly controlled. Let me ask again, why were my children removed from first class? Janet Mills was scrambling now, her mind racing through protocols and procedures and corporate liability and everything she'd learned in 15 years of airline management, and none of it had prepared her for this. I'll review the incident immediately, Mr. Johnson. You have 10 minutes. I want security footage, staff statements, and the name of every person involved. 10 minutes, Ms. Mills. After that, I make a phone call to your CEO, and I explain to him why this merger isn't happening. The line went dead. Janet Mills sat staring at her phone, and then she started moving faster, than she'd moved in her entire career. She pulled Patricia and Derek into her office. She called security for footage. She pulled up Christine Bradford's passenger record, and what she found in that record, in those 10 minutes of frantic investigation, would change everything. Meanwhile, David was making other calls. To his legal team, to his board members, to Richard Chun, who'd been his mentor and friend for 20 years. "David," Richard said when he answered, "the merger closes tomorrow. Please tell me you're not doing anything rash." "Define rash." "Whatever you're thinking right now." David looked at the merger documents again. "Richard, how many times have you been kicked off a flight?" "Never." "How many times have your kids?" Silence. This merger was supposed to change SkyConnect's culture. Clearly, they need more than capital. They need a complete overhaul. And I'm going to give it to them. In the airport terminal, Maya had stopped crying. She was watching the adults panic, watching the gate supervisor bark orders into her phone, watching Robert Feldman avoid eye contact with her and Marcus. And she understood something about power that she'd never fully grasped before. Her father had power. Real power. The kind of power that made airline executives scramble. The kind of power that could change systems, not just navigate them. Marcus whispered, "Dad's really mad, isn't he?" Maya nodded. "Yeah, but not at us. Never at us." And somewhere, on a plane that was now cruising at 30,000 feet, Christine Bradford sat in seat 2C, probably feeling quite satisfied with herself, having no idea that the children she'd humiliated had a father who was about to make her regret every single choice that had led to this moment. The 10 minutes were almost up, and David Johnson was just getting started. Janet Mills had 10 minutes to save her career and possibly her company. The clock was ticking. She stood in her office at the SkyConnect terminal, phone still warm from the conversation that had just ended, and she moved with the kind of frantic precision that comes from pure survival instinct. She called Patricia and Derek into her office. She demanded security footage. She pulled up passenger records. And with every piece of information she uncovered, the situation got worse. But while Janet scrambled, David Johnson was already 3 steps ahead. Because here's the thing about powerful people who've had to fight for every inch of respect they've ever received. They don't wait for systems to work. They make the systems work for them. David was still on the phone with his assistant, Lauren, who was already deep in her own investigation. Lauren had been with David since the early days of Stratosphere Capital, back when the company was just David and a dream and a small office in a building that smelled like old coffee. She'd learned to anticipate what he needed before he asked for it. And right now, she knew he needed ammunition. "I've got Christine Bradford's information," Lauren said, her fingers flying across her keyboard. She's VP of Operations at Westfield Insurance. David filed that information away. VP of Operations. Senior executive. Someone who should know better. "What else?" David asked. "They have a $50 million corporate account with SkyConnect." And there it was. The reason why a woman could complain 47 times and never face consequences. The reason why 2 children with valid tickets could be removed from a plane to appease one person's prejudice. Money. Corporate relationships. The eternal calculus of businesses that value profit over principle. "Keep digging," David said, and Lauren dug. What she found would become evidence in a pattern of discrimination so clear, so documented, so undeniable that even the best lawyers couldn't explain it away. Christine Bradford had filed 47 complaints with SkyConnect Airlines in just 18 months. 47. Let that number sink in. That's more than 2 complaints per month. That's a complaint every 2 weeks for a year and a half. But here's what made those complaints devastating evidence rather than just the actions of a difficult passenger. Every single complaint was against passengers of color. Not some, not most, all of them. Every complaint Christine Bradford filed was against a black passenger, a Latino passenger, an Asian passenger, people whose only crime was existing in first class while not being white. And every single one of those complaints happened in first class, not in economy, not in premium economy, only in first class. Christine Bradford had no problem sharing a cabin with people of color when they were in the back of the plane. But the moment they entered that premium space, the moment they sat in those leather seats that she apparently viewed as exclusively hers, she had a problem. Lauren dug deeper into the complaints themselves. Her screen filled with incident reports, passenger statements, crew notes. She read through them with growing disgust. Passengers seemed suspicious, constantly looking around. The passenger had been a black businessman checking his laptop. Passenger was loud and disruptive. The passenger had been a Latina woman on a business call before takeoff. Passenger appeared to be in the wrong seat. The passenger had been an elderly Asian man with a valid first-class ticket. Passenger's behavior made me uncomfortable. The passenger had been a black woman reading a book. Every complaint used language designed to make the crew suspicious, to justify removal, to paint people of color as somehow out of place, somehow threatening, somehow wrong for existing in a space they'd paid for. And the most damning part? Not one of these complaints resulted in actual ticket fraud. Not one resulted in any violation of airline policy. Not one passenger was actually doing anything wrong. They were just existing while not being white. But here's what made this a systemic problem rather than just one racist passenger. SkyConnect never investigated. Not once. They just issued flight credits to appease Christine Bradford. They moved other passengers. They rebooked people. They did whatever it took to keep their $50 million corporate client happy. They chose profit over principle. They chose corporate relationships over human dignity. And they did it 47 times. Lauren compiled everything into a document. Dates, times, passenger names were available, complaint details, outcomes. She sent it to David. He read through it in silence. His face didn't change. His expression remained perfectly controlled. But Lauren, who knew him better than almost anyone, could see the rage burning behind his eyes. David made another call to Richard Chun, a member of his board and one of his oldest friends in the business world. Richard had been David's mentor when David was just starting out, a young black CO trying to raise capital in rooms that didn't want him there. Richard had vouched for him, opened doors, taught him how to navigate spaces that weren't built for people who looked like them. Richard answered on the second ring. David, the merger closes tomorrow. Please tell me you're not doing anything rash. David's laugh was bitter. Define rash. Whatever you're thinking right now. There was a pause. David turned to look at the family photo on his desk. Maya's intelligent eyes staring back at him. Marcus's joyful grin. And suddenly, David wasn't in his San Francisco office anymore. He was 8 years old, shopping with his mother at a department store in their neighborhood. The memory came flooding back with crystal clarity. Young David, 8 years old, excited because his mother had promised him new shoes for school. They walked into the store, and within minutes, a security guard started following them. Not subtly, not professionally, obviously, blatantly, following a black woman and her child through a store as if their very presence suggested criminal intent. His mother had noticed. She always noticed. She'd pulled David close and whispered, "Keep your hands where they can see them. Baby, don't touch anything. Don't give them a reason." 8 years old. And he was already learning to make himself smaller, less threatening, more acceptable to people who viewed his existence as suspicious. Another memory. Teenage David, 16 years old, driving his mother's car home from a friend's house. Red and blue lights flashing behind him. He'd pulled over, hands shaking, knowing the statistics, knowing the danger. The officer had approached, flashlight in his face, demanding to know where he was going, where he was coming from, whose car this was. You match a description, the officer had said. The description of what? Being black in a car? Being young and black, and daring to drive through a nice neighborhood? He'd sat there, hands visible on the steering wheel like his mother had taught him, saying yes, sir, and no, sir, being as non-threatening as possible, praying this wouldn't be the traffic stop that ended with his name becoming a hashtag. Another memory. David in college, working late in the computer lab he'd essentially built. He'd fundraised for the equipment, designed the layout, spent countless hours setting up the systems. A visiting investor had walked in, seen David, and asked, "When do the students get here?" And can you make sure the coffee station is clean before they arrive? The investor had assumed David was a janitor in the computer lab David had built, in the university where David was a star student. And the memory that hurt most of all, David's first major business pitch, 26 years old, tried to raise capital for his first venture. He'd walked into a conference room full of investors, all white, all men, all skeptical. He presented his business plan flawlessly. The numbers were solid. The market opportunity was clear. The competitive advantage was undeniable. And at the end, one investor had leaned back in his chair and asked, "So, who's really the CEO? Is it you, or do you have a partner we should be talking to?" The implication was clear. Surely this young black man couldn't actually be capable of running a company. Surely there was someone else, someone more believable, someone whiter, pulling the strings. David had built an empire to escape those moments. He'd worked 80-hour weeks, sacrificed time with his family, pushed himself to levels of excellence that white executives never had to achieve just to be taken seriously. He'd done all of that so his children wouldn't have to experience what he'd experienced. And today, SkyConnect Airlines had taught Maya and Marcus the lesson David had spent his entire adult life trying to shield them from, that no matter how valid your ticket is, no matter how much you belong in a space, someone will always try to make you feel like you don't. David's voice, when he spoke to Richard, was quiet but absolute. "Richard, how many times have you been kicked off a flight?" Richard paused. "Never." "How many times have your kids?" Silence. Richard Chun was Asian American, had faced his own share of discrimination, but he'd never been removed from a flight. His children had never experienced that particular humiliation. "David, this merger was supposed to change SkyConnect's culture. Clearly, they need more than capital. They need a complete overhaul." Richard tried reason. "David, if you walk away from this deal, you're leaving money on the table. Your investors will understand. And if they don't, they can divest. I'm not putting $340 million into a company that traumatizes children for profit. So you're walking?" "I didn't say that." David's tone shifted. "I'm renegotiating from a position of strength." Back at the airport, in a family lounge that smelled like stale coffee and recycled air, Maya and Marcus sat on uncomfortable couches, trying to process what just happened to them. Marcus broke the silence. "Is Dad going to sue them?" Maya shook her head. "I don't know. I just feel so stupid. You didn't do anything wrong." "I know." Maya's voice cracked slightly. "But everyone looked at us like we didn't belong there, like we'd done something wrong, like we were criminals or liars or, I don't know, like we weren't good enough to be there." Marcus was quiet for a moment, processing with the analytical mind that made him so good at coding, at breaking down complex problems into solvable components. Finally, he asked, "Do you think Mom ever felt like this?" Maya looked at her brother. Their mother, Jennifer, was a successful attorney, brilliant and accomplished. But Maya was old enough to understand what that success had cost. The microaggressions Jennifer dealt with in courtrooms. The times clients assumed she was a paralegal instead of the lead attorney. The way she had to work twice as hard to get half the respect her white male colleagues received automatically. "All the time," Maya said quietly. "That's why Dad worked so hard. So we won't have to feel like this." But here they were, feeling exactly like this anyway. The airport TV was on in the background, showing a business news channel. Marcus wasn't really paying attention until he heard something that made him freeze. Breaking news. Stratosphere Capital merger with SkyConnect Airlines in final stages. The $340 million deal is expected to close tomorrow, creating one of the largest private equity acquisitions in the airline industry this year. Marcus grabbed Maya's arm. "Wait, that's Dad's company." Maya looked up at the screen. Stratosphere Capital, her father's firm. The company he'd built from nothing. And they were merging with SkyConnect. "And that's the airline that just kicked us off," Maya said slowly, the implications dawning on her. They looked at each other, and in that moment, the whole situation shifted. They weren't just two kids who'd been humiliated. They were the children of a man who was about to own 40% of the airline that had humiliated them. Marcus's eyes went wide. Oh no. But Maya's expression was different. There was something fierce in it, something that looked a lot like her father. Oh yes. Because Maya understood something that Marcus, at 13, was just beginning to grasp. Their father had power. Real, institutional, change-making power. And he was about to use every bit of it. In San Francisco, David's 10-minute deadline had passed. Janet Mills called him back, her voice shaky. Mr. Johnson, I've reviewed the incident. There were clear procedural violations. Your children should never have been removed from the aircraft. I've suspended the flight attendants pending investigation, and I want to personally apologize. I don't want your apology, Ms. Mills. I want answers. Who is Christine Bradford? Janet hesitated. She's a passenger, a frequent flyer with our airline. She's VP of Operations at Westfield Insurance, which has a $50 million corporate account with SkyConnect. And she's filed 47 complaints against passengers of color in the past 18 months. None of which your airline investigated, all of which you accommodated by removing paying passengers to keep her comfortable. Silence on the other end of the line. So let me ask you directly, Ms. Mills, does SkyConnect Airlines have a policy of enabling racial discrimination to protect corporate revenue? Mr. Johnson, we would never. Your actions speak louder than your denials. I have documentation. I have dates, times, passenger names. I have a pattern of discrimination so clear that any first-year law student could make a case against you. And I'm currently deciding whether to proceed with a $340 million acquisition of your company or to walk away and release this information to every major media outlet in the country. Janet Mills realized in that moment that she was in far over her head. This wasn't something she could smooth over with flight credits and corporate apologies. This was existential. What do you want, Mr. Johnson? David smiled, though there was no warmth in it. I want to speak to your CEO. I want every executive involved in passenger services on a call in 1 hour. And I want you to understand something very clearly, Ms. Mills. My children are sitting in an airport right now, humiliated and hurt, because your company values money over human dignity. That ends today. Whether SkyConnect survives, what comes next depends entirely on what your CEO does in the next 60 minutes. He hung up. Lauren was watching him, and she'd seen that expression before. It was the expression David got when he was about to reshape an industry. Are you really going to walk from the merger? Lauren asked. David looked at his family photo again. No, I'm going to close it, but on my terms. And by the time I'm done, SkyConnect won't just be a different company. It'll be a different kind of company. Back at the airport, Maya's phone buzzed. A text from her father. I love you both. This isn't your fault. And it's going to be okay. I promise. She showed Marcus. He read it and nodded. They didn't know exactly what their father was planning, but they knew their dad. And when David Johnson made a promise, he kept it. On the TV screen, the business news continued. The reporter was talking about the SkyConnect merger, about market expectations, about projected returns. None of them knew that in the next hour, everything was about to change. Marcus leaned against his sister. I'm glad Dad's our dad. Maya wrapped an arm around her brother. Me too. And somewhere, Christine Bradford's flight was landing, and she had no idea that the children she'd humiliated had just set in motion a chain of events that would cost her everything. The investigation was complete. The pattern was documented. The evidence was undeniable. And David Johnson was about to teach an entire industry what happens when you value the wrong things. In the executive offices of SkyConnect Airlines, an emergency video conference was hastily assembled. The kind of meeting that happens when everything is on fire and nobody knows how to put it out. Thomas Weatherby sat at the head of the conference table, a man in his 60s who represented the old guard of airline executives. He'd been in this industry for 40 years, survived deregulation, 9/11, the financial crisis, and countless labor disputes. He thought he'd seen everything. He was about to learn he was wrong. On the screens around him were the faces of his leadership team. The CFO, already running numbers in his head about what this crisis might cost. The COO, who oversaw operations and was realizing that operations had failed spectacularly. The legal team, already thinking about liability and lawsuits and how to minimize damage. And Janet Mills, the airport supervisor who'd made the call that triggered this entire catastrophe, looking like she wanted to disappear into her chair. Thomas started the meeting with a question that barely concealed his fury. Someone tell me why our largest pending investor is threatening to walk from a $340 million merger. Janet Mills took a breath and explained. 2 children, unaccompanied minors, first-class tickets, a passenger complaint, the decision to remove them from the aircraft, and then the terrible, horrible discovery of who those children's father was. As she spoke, Thomas's face grew darker. When she finished, there was a moment of silence while everyone processed the magnitude of the disaster. The legal counsel, trying to salvage something, offered the flight attendants follow protocol for disputed tickets. The SOO, who'd actually read the incident report, shot that down immediately. The tickets weren't disputed. They were valid, verified in the system. A passenger complained, and we removed paying customers to appease her. The CFO added another layer of complication. Christine Bradford. She's VP of Operations at Westfield Insurance. They have a $50 million corporate account with us. And there it was, the ugly truth laid bare. SkyConnect had chosen a $50 million corporate relationship over the dignity of 2 children. Thomas Weatherby, to his credit, understood immediately how bad this was. So we sided with a corporate account over 2 kids. Silence. The kind of silence that happens when everyone knows the answer and no one wants to say it out loud. Thomas continued, his voice heavy with the weight of what they'd done. And these kids belong to David Johnson, who's about to own 40% of this airline. More silence. Heavier now, because the implications were staggering. They hadn't just made a customer service error. They'd humiliated the children of a man who was days away from becoming their largest shareholder, a man who had a significant control over the future of their company. The legal counsel, desperate to find a solution, suggested, we should offer compensation, flight credits, apology letter, maybe a voucher for... The phone on Thomas's desk rang, interrupting the lawyer mid-sentence. Thomas looked at the caller ID. Unknown number. Something in his gut told him to answer it. This is Thomas Weatherby. The voice on the other end was calm, controlled, and absolutely terrifying in its composure. Mr. Weatherby, we need to talk. David Johnson, the man himself. Thomas put the call on speaker so the entire executive team could hear. Mr. Johnson, I want to begin by apologizing for what happened to your children. This is not how SkyConnect treats passengers, and... David cut him off. I'm looking at 18 months of complaints from Christine Bradford, 47 incidents, harassment, discrimination, creating hostile environments. Your staff enabled her every single time. Thomas felt his stomach drop. This wasn't just about today's incident. David had been digging, and what he'd found was damning. Thomas tried to respond with corporate reassurance. Mr. Johnson, I assure you will investigate these allegations. I already did. David's voice was cold. Your company culture protects profits over people. Specifically, it protects white comfort over everyone else's dignity. That's a serious accusation. David didn't back down an inch. It's a documented pattern. 47 complaints from Christine Bradford, all against passengers of color, none investigated. But I kept digging, Mr. Weatherby. I found over 200 similar complaints from other passengers of color over the past 3 years. Dismissed, unresolved, buried in your customer service database like dirty secrets you hoped no one would find. The executives around the table were pale now. 200 complaints. 200 incidents of passengers of color reporting discrimination, and the airline had done nothing. Not investigated. Not addressed. Not even acknowledged. They just filed the complaints away and moved on, prioritizing corporate efficiency and avoiding uncomfortable conversations over passenger dignity. Thomas Weatherby was sweating now, and not just from the stress. He was realizing that this wasn't a crisis that could be managed with the usual corporate playbook. This was something different, something that required actual accountability. "What do you want, Mr. Johnson?" David's answer came without hesitation. "Initially, I wanted to burn this merger to the ground and watch your stock collapse. I want to call Bloomberg, the Wall Street Journal, and every major news outlet and give them a story about how SkyConnect Airline systematically discriminates against passengers of color to protect corporate relationships. I wanted to see your company destroyed." Thomas felt his heart hammering. "And now I want something more permanent. I want change. Real institutional, lasting change." And then David laid out his terms. 9 specific demands, each one carefully calculated, each one designed not just to punish but to transform. First, Christine Bradford will be permanently banned from SkyConnect. Not suspended, not given a warning. Banned. Her name would go on a no-fly list, and she would never set foot on one of their aircraft again. The woman who'd filed 47 discriminatory complaints would face actual consequences for her actions. Second, Westfield Insurance's corporate account would be suspended immediately, pending their response to what their VP of Operations had been doing. SkyConnect would send Westfield a detailed report of Christine Bradford's complaint history and give them a choice: address the behavior of their executive or lose the partnership. $50 million in annual revenue on the line because David was forcing SkyConnect to choose between money and principles. Third, complete anti-discrimination training overhaul for all staff, not the usual checkbox corporate training that everyone clicks through without reading. Real, meaningful education developed by civil rights experts with accountability measures and regular testing. Flight attendants, gate agents, customer service representatives, everyone who interacted with passengers would undergo intensive training on implicit bias, discrimination, and how to serve all passengers with equal dignity. Fourth, an independent review board for passenger complaints. No more burying complaints in databases. No more dismissing concerns from passengers of color. An independent board with representatives from civil rights organizations would review every discrimination complaint, investigate thoroughly, and have the power to recommend disciplinary action, policy changes, and systemic reforms. Fifth, 3 seats on SkyConnect's board of directors would go to candidates personally selected by David Johnson, and all 3 would be from underrepresented backgrounds. A black civil rights attorney who'd spent her career fighting discrimination, a disability advocate who understood what it meant to be treated as less than, a Latino aviation executive who'd spent 20 years fighting for inclusion in an industry that didn't want him. These weren't token appointments. These were people with power, with voice, with the ability to shape policy and demand accountability. Sixth, a $10 million fund for diversity initiatives and employee training. Not pocket change, not a symbolic gesture. $10 million, managed independently, dedicated specifically to making SkyConnect a company that served all passengers equally. Training programs, scholarship initiatives for underrepresented groups in aviation, partnerships with civil rights organizations, all funded permanently. Seventh, Patricia and Derek, the flight attendants who'd removed Maya and Marcus from the plane, would be suspended pending full investigation, not fired outright, because David believed in the possibility of education and growth, but suspended. They'd undergo intensive retraining. They have to demonstrate real understanding of what they'd done wrong, and only if they showed genuine growth would they be allowed to return to work. Eighth, a public apology to Maya and Marcus Johnson, not a corporate statement, not a press release, a personal, public apology from Thomas Weatherby himself, acknowledging what had been done to them, taking responsibility and committing to change. Ninth, if SkyConnect refused any of these terms, David would walk from the merger immediately. He'd cancel the $340 million deal. He'd pull out publicly, explaining exactly why. And he'd release every piece of discrimination data he'd compiled to every major media outlet in the country. The Wall Street Journal would get the financial impact. CNN would get the human stories. Social media would get the receipts. SkyConnect stock would crash. Their reputation would be destroyed. And every passenger who'd ever been discriminated against would have ammunition for lawsuits that could bankrupt the company. When David finished laying out his terms, there was absolute silence on the call. Finally, Thomas Weatherby spoke, and his voice was shaking. "You're blackmailing us." David's response was ice cold and absolutely final. "I'm correcting a system that kicked children off a plane for being black in first class. I'm using the leverage I have to force accountability that should have existed all along. I'm making sure that what happened to my children never happens to anyone else's children. Call it whatever you want, Mr. Weatherby, but those are my terms. You have 24 hours to decide. After that, I'm walking, and I'm going public with everything." The line went dead. The executives sat in stunned silence. The legal counsel started to speak, proud to argue about the impossibility of these demands. But Thomas held up his hand. "He's right," Thomas said quietly. Everyone stared at him. "He's right," Thomas repeated. "We did enable this. We did prioritize money over people. We did dismiss complaints from passengers of color because it was easier than addressing the problem. And now we're going to pay for it. Not with money, though God knows this will cost us money. We're going to pay for it with actual change." The CFO protested. "Thomas, $10 million, 3 board seats, suspending the Westfield account, is less than we deserve." Thomas cut him off. "Do you know what happens if he walks and goes public? Our stock drops 40% overnight. We face lawsuits from every passenger who's ever filed a discrimination complaint. The FAA investigates our training procedures. We lose partnerships across the board. $10 million and 3 board seats will be the cheapest lesson we ever learn." Thomas looked at each executive in turn. "We're accepting his terms. All of them. And we're going to do better. We're going to be better. Because if we don't, we deserve to fail." While the executives were processing their new reality, David Johnson made another call, this one to Maya and Marcus, who were still sitting in the airport family lounge, waiting to see how their world would change. Maya answered on the first ring. "Dad." "Hey, sweetheart." David's voice was warm now, the cold edge gone. This was the voice he used for his children, full of love and protection. "Dad, we're okay," Maya said quickly, not wanting him to worry. "I know you are. You're strong. Both of you are so strong." David paused. "But you shouldn't have to be strong against this kind of treatment. You shouldn't have to armor yourselves against the world just to exist in spaces you've paid for." Maya felt tears starting again. "What's going to happen?" "Change. Real change. Not just for you, but for everyone who looks like us and gets treated like they don't belong. I just got off the phone with Sky Connect's CEO. They're going to do better. I'm going to make sure of it." Marcus took the phone. "Did you cancel merger?" "No. I'm going through with it, because now I'll have the power to fix things from the inside. I'll be on their board. I'll have oversight. I'll make sure this never happens again." Marcus's voice was small. "So we ruin your business deal?" David's response was fierce and immediate. "You didn't ruin anything. They did. They made choices that led to this. They built a system that allowed discrimination. They enabled a woman who filed 47 complaints against people of color. You didn't do anything wrong. You were just 2 kids trying to fly first class. And now they'll pay for what they did, not with money, but with accountability." Maya took the phone back. "Will we get back on a plane?" "I don't know if I can." "Yes, on my private jet, which is picking you up in 1 hour." There was a pause. Then Marcus's voice, incredulous, came through. "We have a private jet." David smiled. "As of 30 minutes ago, yes. I made a call. It's a charter, but it's ours for today. Some things are worth the investment. My children should never have to fear being kicked off a plane again. And while I'm working to fix the system so no one's children have to fear that, in the meantime, you're flying private." Maya was quiet for a moment. "Dad, that's expensive." "Not as expensive as the lesson Sky Connect is about to learn. Not as expensive as allowing my children to believe they did something wrong when they didn't. Not as expensive as letting you think you don't belong in first class when you absolutely do." Marcus asked, "What happens to the lady?" "The one who complained. Christine Bradford is banned from Sky Connect. Permanently. And her company is being notified of her behavior. She'll face consequences. Marcus. Real ones." Maya whispered, "I don't want anyone to lose their job because of us." "And this," This right here was why David fought so hard. His children were worried about the people who'd hurt them. They were kind, empathetic, good humans who didn't cause harm even to those who'd harmed them. Baby girl, listen to me. The flight attendants aren't losing their jobs. They're being retrained. They made a mistake, and they'll learn from it. Christine Bradford isn't losing her job because of you. She's facing consequences for filing 47 discriminatory complaints. These aren't punishments you caused. These are consequences for actions people chose to take. The private jet arrived exactly 1 hour later. Maya and Marcus boarded a Gulfstream G650, all leather seats and personal space and luxury that felt surreal after what they'd experienced. The pilot greeted them personally. "Johnson family, welcome aboard. We're ready when you are." As the jet took off, climbing above the city where they'd been humiliated just hours before, Marcus looked at his sister. "This is crazy." Maya nodded. "Yeah, but also, maybe this is what normal should feel like. Being treated well, being believed, being respected." Marcus looked out the window at the clouds. "Do you think it'll really change? The airline, I mean." Maya thought about her father, about the determination in his voice, about the power he wielded and the principles that guided how he wielded it. "Yeah," she said. "I think Dad's going to make sure it does." Below them, in airports across the country, SkyConnect employees were receiving emergency training notifications, policy updates, new complaint procedures, the beginning of institutional change that would ripple through the entire industry. And in a corporate office, Christine Bradford was being called into a meeting with her company's HR department, about to learn that actions have consequences, even for VPs who thought themselves untouchable. David Johnson sat in his San Francisco office, looking at the merger documents. Tomorrow, he'd sign them. Tomorrow, he'd become a major shareholder in SkyConnect Airlines. And he'd use that power to ensure that no child, no passenger, no human being would ever be made to feel less than for existing in a space they'd paid for. Some people might say he was being too harsh, that he was using his leverage unfairly. That corporate America doesn't work this way. But David would disagree. Corporate America works exactly however those with power decide it works. And he just decided it was going to work differently. His children were safe. They were on a private jet, flying to their mother's birthday party, where they'd be loved and celebrated and reminded that they were worthy. And an entire airline was about to learn that discrimination has consequences, that enabling racism for profit isn't acceptable. That change is possible when those with power demand it. The reckoning was complete. The terms were set. And tomorrow, when David Johnson signed those merger papers, SkyConnect Airlines would become something different, something better. Because sometimes justice isn't about revenge. It's about using power to protect people who don't have power. It's about making systems fair when they've been unjust. It's about ensuring that the next child who boards a plane with a valid ticket won't be kicked off because someone doesn't think they belong there. That's what David Johnson was fighting for. And he just won. 6 weeks later, the world looked different. Turn on any business news channel, and you'd see the headlines. SkyConnect announces major diversity initiative following discrimination allegations. Airline industry faces reckoning over passenger treatment. Corporate America responds to high-profile discrimination case. But one headline stood out among the rest, smaller, tucked into the business section of regional newspapers, easy to miss if you weren't paying attention. Christine Bradford resigns from Westfield Insurance amid scandal. Christine Bradford, VP of Operations, the woman who'd filed 47 complaints against passengers of color, the woman who'd felt so entitled to first-class exclusivity that she'd gotten 2 children kicked off a plane, had resigned. Not retired gracefully, not moved to another position. Resigned under pressure after Westfield Insurance received a detailed report of her complaint history from SkyConnect Airlines. Westfield had a choice: stand by an executive who'd systematically harass people of color or protect their company's reputation. They chose their reputation. Christine Bradford's 20-year career ended not with a gold watch and a retirement party, but with a quiet resignation announcement and a severance package that came with a non-disclosure agreement. She thought she was untouchable. She'd been wrong. But Christine Bradford's downfall was just one small piece of a much larger transformation. In a SkyConnect first-class cabin, not on a flight, but on the ground in a training facility, flight attendants sat in rows of seats identical to the ones they worked in every day. Among them was Patricia, the senior flight attendant who'd made the call to remove Maya and Marcus from the plane. She kept her job, but only after completing an intensive remediation program that forced her to confront the biases she didn't even know she had. The diversity consultant leading the training wasn't there to make anyone comfortable. She was there to create the kind of discomfort that leads to growth. Let's talk about implicit bias, the consultant said. Let's talk about the assumptions you make when you see a passenger who doesn't look like what you think a first-class passenger should look like. Let's talk about the policies you think you're following that are actually just bias wrapped in corporate language. Patricia sat in that training, and for the first time, she really listened. She thought about Maya and Marcus. She thought about how her hands had been shaking slightly when she asked to see their tickets again. She thought about how she'd been uncomfortable, not because there was anything wrong with her tickets, but because a white woman had planted a seed of doubt that Patricia had watered with her own unconscious biases. Later, in an interview that would become part of SkyConnect's internal training materials, Patricia said something that took real courage to admit. I thought I was following policy. I didn't see I was enforcing bias. That's on me to fix. I removed 2 children from plane because I was more concerned with appeasing a white passenger's discomfort than protecting 2 black children's dignity. I have to live with that, and I have to do better. That interview became required viewing for every SkyConnect employee, not to shame Patricia, but to show that growth is possible, that acknowledgement is a first step toward change, that people can learn from their mistakes if they're willing to face them honestly. The new passenger complaint system that David had demanded was now operational. Anonymous, transparent, tracked. Every complaint was logged in a database that independent reviewers could access. Patterns couldn't hide anymore. If a passenger filed multiple complaints against people of a specific race, the system flagged it. If a route consistently had discrimination complaints, the system flagged it. If a flight attendant received multiple similar complaints, the system flagged it. And the independent review board that David had insisted on, it had real power, real authority, real ability to investigate and recommend consequences. David's 3 board appointees took their seats at the table where SkyConnect's most important decisions were made. A former civil rights attorney who'd spent 30 years fighting discrimination in housing, employment, and public accommodations. A disability advocate who'd been told her entire life that she couldn't do things, who'd proven everyone wrong, and who now made sure that airlines served passengers with disabilities with dignity and respect. A Latino aviation executive who'd spent 20 years fighting for inclusion in an industry that hadn't wanted him, who'd been passed over for promotions, who'd been told his accent was unprofessional, who now had the power to change the culture that had tried to exclude him. These weren't token appointments. These were people with expertise, with passion, with lived experience of discrimination, and now with institutional power to demand change. And in first-class cabins across SkyConnect's fleet, something had shifted. If you flew SkyConnect in those weeks after the policy changes, you'd notice it. The passengers in first class looked different, more diverse, not because of quotas or optics, but because of barriers that had kept people out, the subtle discrimination, the uncomfortable stares, the questioning of tickets, the prioritizing of white comfort, had been addressed. On one flight, in seat 3A, a young black girl sat with her parents. She was maybe 10 years old, wearing a purple dress, her hair in beautiful braids, completely absorbed in the book she was reading. She looked up once when the flight attendant came by to offer her a drink, smiled politely, said, "Apple juice, please," and went back to her book. She was unbothered, confident, belonging. She didn't know about Maya and Marcus Johnson. She didn't know about the fight that had been fought, so she could sit in that seat without fear. She didn't know that 6 weeks earlier, 2 teenagers had been humiliated so that the system would change. She just knew she belonged there, and that was the entire point. Because change isn't just about policy. It's about culture. It's about creating a world where a 10-year-old black girl can sit in first class reading her book without anyone questioning whether she belongs there. At the Johnson family home in Atlanta, Jennifer's 40th birthday party was finally happening. Weeks late, but no less joyful. The house was filled with family, friends, music, laughter, and the smell of food that only comes from family recipes passed down through generations. In the living room, Maya and Marcus were surrounded by their younger cousins, who'd heard bits and pieces of the story and wanted to know everything. Kids always want to know everything, especially when it involves their cool older cousins and some kind of dramatic incident. "So they really kicked you off the plane?" one cousin asked, eyes wide. "Yeah," Marcus said. "Made us walk down the whole aisle while everyone stared." "That's so messed up," another cousin said. "And then what happened?" The youngest cousin asked, the question that every good story needs someone to ask. Marcus grinned. "Dad made them change everything." But Maya, who'd been quieter, who'd spent the past 6 weeks processing what had happened and what it meant, corrected him gently. "We made them change. By not being ashamed of who we are. By having valid tickets and knowing we belonged there. By refusing to believe we'd done something wrong when we hadn't." Marcus looked at his sister and nodded. She was right. Their father had wielded power, yes, but they'd done something too. They'd existed authentically in a space that didn't want them. They'd refused to shrink. They'd held on to their dignity, even when people tried to strip it from them. David overheard this exchange in the kitchen, where he was helping set out food, and he smiled. That smile of a parent who realizes their children understand something important, something that will serve them for the rest of their lives. Jennifer found him a few minutes later, pulled him aside into quiet of their home office, away from the party noise. "You didn't have to buy a jet," she said, though her tone made it clear she wasn't actually criticizing. David looked at his wife, the woman who stood beside him through every struggle, every triumph, every moment of building something from nothing. "Yes, I did. Our kids will never be made to feel less than for existing in a space they paid for. Not if I can prevent it." Jennifer's response cut to the heart of the matter. "What about the other kids? The ones whose parents can't buy airlines or charter jets?" David's expression became serious. "That's why I didn't just threaten them. I'm on the board now. Those kids have an advocate. Someone who understands what it means to be discriminated against. Someone who has the power to change policies, to review complaints, to ensure that what happened to Maya and Marcus doesn't happen to anyone else." Jennifer squeezed his hand. She'd married a man with principles, and watching him use his power to protect not just their children, but all children made her fall in love with him all over again. "You know," she said, "when I was their age, I got kicked out of store for suspicious behavior. I was just browsing, just existing while black in a nice store. I never told you that." David pulled her close. "I'm sorry. Don't be sorry. Be what you are, someone who uses power to change things. That's rare, David. Most people with your kind of power just protect themselves and people like them. You're protecting everyone." Upstairs in Maya and Marcus's shared bedroom, on the wall between their beds, there was something new among the familiar decorations. Maya's debate trophy still stood proudly on her shelf, representing hours of research and practice and intellectual combat. Marcus's aviation sketches still covered his bulletin board, intricate drawings of aircraft designs that showed a mind that understood how things worked and how they could work better. But now, hanging in a simple black frame between their beds, were 2 boarding passes. First class, seats 2A and 2B, SkyConnect Airlines. The boarding passes from the flight they never took. Some people might ask why they'd keep them, why they'd frame a reminder of one of the worst days of their young lives, why they'd hang a symbol of humiliation on their wall where they'd see it every day. But Maya and Marcus knew why. Maya's voice, quiet and thoughtful, as if she was speaking to someone who wasn't there but needed to hear this. "People ask if we do it differently. Avoid that seat. Stay quiet. Make ourselves smaller. But we weren't the problem. We never were. And we never will be." Marcus's voice, carrying the wisdom of someone who'd learned a hard lesson early and grown from it. Sometimes the cost of change is discomfort, and sometimes that discomfort is exactly what the world needs. Those boarding passes weren't a reminder of shame. They were a reminder of strength, of standing firm when the world tried to move you, of knowing your worth when others tried to diminish it, of the moment that sparked change not just for them, but for everyone who came after them. In his office in San Francisco, David Johnson sat at his desk, the same desk where this had all started, where he'd received a phone call that his children had been kicked off a plane, where he'd made the decision to use his power to demand justice. He was signing the final SkyConnect merger papers. $340 million, 3,000 new jobs, and more importantly, institutional change that would ripple through the entire airline industry. His signature was firm, clear, final. As he set down his pen, the camera would pull back slowly, revealing more of his office. The floor-to-ceiling windows with a view of the Golden Gate Bridge, the degrees and awards on the walls, the markers of successful life built through decades of work. And there, on the wall behind his desk, the family photo was still in its place of honor. Jennifer, Maya, Marcus, all smiling. But next to it now hung something new. A framed news article, professionally mounted. SkyConnect leads industry in passenger rights reform. The article detailed the changes that had swept through the airline, the new training programs, the independent review board, the complaint tracking system, the board appointments, the cultural transformation that was happening gate by gate, flight by flight, passenger by passenger. Other airlines were watching. Some were mocking SkyConnect for going too far, for being too politically correct, for prioritizing social justice over profit. But others were quietly implementing similar changes, realizing that the winds were shifting, that passengers were paying attention, that discrimination was bad business. David looked at that article, at his family photo, and felt something that successful people don't always get to feel. Not pride in his wealth, not satisfaction with his status, but genuine belief that he'd used his power for something that mattered. His children would grow up knowing that their father had fought for them. But more than that, they'd grow up knowing that justice was possible, that change was achievable, that standing up for yourself and others wasn't just brave. It was necessary. The screen faded to black. And then, in simple white text on that black background, words appeared. Real change happens when those with power choose justice over comfort. Let those words sit with you for a moment. Real change happens when those with power choose justice over comfort. Because that's what the story was really about. Not revenge, not a lawsuit, not a viral video, or a hashtag campaign. It was about a man who had institutional power and chose to use it not just to protect his own children, but to change a system that hurt everyone. How many people with David Johnson's power would have taken the settlement, accepted the apology and the flight credits, and moved on? How many would have let the airline sweep this under the rug to preserve a business relationship? David chose differently. He chose discomfort. He chose to make executives squirm, to force conversations that corporations don't want to have, to use his leverage to demand real, lasting institutional change. And because he made that choice, a 10-year-old black girl can now sit in first class reading her book, unbothered and belonging. Because he made that choice, flight attendants are learning to recognize their biases instead of acting on them unconsciously. Because he made that choice, an independent review board is tracking discrimination complaints and holding people accountable. Because he made that choice, 3 board members with lived experience of discrimination now have power to shape policy. This wasn't just one family story. This was a story about what becomes possible when people refuse to accept injustice as inevitable. Maya and Marcus didn't ask to be kicked off that plane. They didn't want to become symbols or catalysts for change. They just wanted to fly first class to their mom's birthday party. But when injustice found them, they didn't shrink from it. They stood in their truth. They knew they'd done nothing wrong. And their father had the power and the principle to turn their pain into purpose. So here's the question I want to leave you with. What would you have done in David Johnson's position? Would you have walked away from $340 million to make a point? Would you have used your leverage to force institutional change, knowing it would make you enemies in corporate America? Would you have chosen justice over comfort, principle over profit, long-term change over short-term peace? Because those are the choices that matter. Those are the moments that define not just who we are, but what kind of world we're building for the kids who come after us. This story moved millions of people. It sparked conversations in boardrooms and living rooms. It made people examine their own biases, their own complicity in systems that harm others. And if it made you think, if it made you uncomfortable in a way that leads to growth, if it reminded you that change is possible when people have the courage to demand it, then do me one favor. Hit that subscribe button, because there are more stories like this that need to be told. Stories of people who refuse to accept injustice. Stories of parents who fought for their children and everyone else's children. Stories of systems that change because someone with power chose to use it for justice instead of comfort. I'm going to keep telling these stories. Stories that matter. Stories that challenge. Stories that remind us what becomes possible when we choose courage over convenience. So subscribe. Join this community of people who believe that real change is possible, who believe that standing up matters, who believe that justice is worth fighting for, even when it's uncomfortable. Because 6 weeks after Maya and Marcus were kicked off that plane, the world was different. Not perfect, not fixed, but different, better, more just. And it started with 2 kids who knew they belonged in first class, with a father who had the power to demand accountability, with a choice to pursue justice instead of accepting the easy path of compensation and silence. That's the world I want to live in. A world where dignity isn't negotiable, where discrimination has consequences, where those with power use it to protect those without it. And that's the world we're building, one story at a time, one subscriber at a time, one person at a time who decides that comfort is less important than justice. Welcome to the movement. Hit subscribe, and let's change the world together.